This lecture is about different types of instrumental conditioning, which is really talking about the relationship between the behavior and the outcome and whether the target behavior increases by this procedure or decreases. So the first is really simple, reward. I think we think of instrumental conditioning and training animals and training people as using reward quite often. B.F. Skinner called this positive reinforcement. And in this case, the S2 is something that they like. It's appetitive. And there's a contingency between the target response, R1, and S2, and that contingency is positive. What I mean by positive is simply when the target response occurs, the good appetitive reward or reinforcement also occurs. When R1 occurs, S2 occurs. I tell a dog to sit. If it sits, it gets a snack. If the R1 doesn't occur, then the S2 doesn't occur. That's called a positive contingency, meaning that they both occur together or not at all. And in reward, the target response tends to increase. The animal tends to, in the future, sit when I say sit. Punishment is also a form of instrumental conditioning, and it has slightly different procedures. Skinner called this positive punishment. In this case, the S2 is aversive. It might be shock, it might be yelling, it might be something bad. So the S2 is aversive in punishment, the S2 is appetitive in reward. But we still have a positive contingency between the target response and the S2. So if I'm trying to train a dog not to pee in the house, a little puppy, the little puppy does this target behavior, peeing in the house, and I would then go, oh, bad dog. And I might scare it a little bit. I might yell at it a little bit. If I see it do it in the house, it gets the aversive S2. If the puppy doesn't pee in the house, then I don't yell at it. In this case, the target response decreases. We're going to talk about punishment and some of the value of punishment and some of the real problems we see with punishment. Now we get into what's called omission. Skinner called this negative punishment. And in this case, the S2 is appetitive. It's good. It's food. It's reward. It's something the animal really likes, something good. But the contingency between the behavior and the outcome is negative, meaning that when the target response happens, there is no reward. There is no food. There is no appetitive S2. If the animal or person fails to do the behavior, then it has the possibility of getting the S2, the reward. So, does the behavior, no reward. Doesn't do the behavior, gets the reward, gets the appetitive S2. And this is a way to make the target response go down. It decreases. It's a way of modifying behavior that we don't like without yelling, without hurting, without causing an aversive S2. Finally, we get into avoidance. Avoidance is sometimes called negative reinforcement. It's oftentimes confused with punishment. Negative reinforcement is oftentimes used to talk about punishment. That is incorrect. Negative reinforcement is another word for avoidance. And in this case, the S2 is aversive. It's something bad. But there's a negative contingency between the target behavior and the outcome, the S2. When the target behavior occurs, the aversive S2 does not occur. Fail to do the R1, fail to do the target response, and the S2 happens. I remember this is kind of the way that my professor in college, in my PhD, kind of dealt with me. Very excellent researcher, a guy named M.E. Bitterman, Great mentor, I think. But he wasn't much on giving rewards for doing good behavior. He was mostly about not giving bad, aversive outcomes if I did good behavior. Let me give you an example. He gives me a paper to read when I first got there. And he comes to my office and he said, "Did you read the paper?" I said, "Yes, I did." And then he starts asking me questions about it. And I didn't know a lot of the answers. And he was really mad. He said, "I give you something to read. You read it all the way through. You really understand it," right? He gives me this aversive outcome. So the target response that he's trying to modify in me was to get me to read papers he gave me thoroughly and really understand them. So he gave me another paper. I read it again and again. I outlined it. I knew it front to back. Comes into my office. He said, "Did you read the paper?" I said, "Yes." And he starts asking me questions. And I answered them all. And instead of going, "Great job, way to go, that's my boy," he just simply looked at me and walked out. So if I did the target behavior, I didn't get yelled at. If I failed to do the target behavior, which is reading the paper thoroughly, I got a little dose of yell at. In this case, the R1 goes up. The target response of getting me to read thoroughly the paper, I did that from then on. Now, escape is similar to avoidance. And how people think about escape depends on who you read. Escape is a type of instrumental conditioning where an animal does behavior to get away from something that's experienced as aversive. So in avoidance, if the target behavior happens, they never see the S2. They never get shocked. They never get yelled at. But in escape, they're experiencing something aversive. And so they might be in a case where they are feeling a little shock on their little paws or something. And then they do the target behavior. And when they do the target behavior, their feet feel better. They're in a better state. Depends on who you read. People a lot of times say, "Oh, this is a different type of negative reinforcement." If they do the behavior, whatever that is, and the shock goes away, they're not feeling the shock anymore, the aversive stimulus. Other people call escape reward because if the animal's a little bit in pain and it moves, it does something, and the pain goes away, it feels better than it did. That's rewarding. Again, depends on who you read. Now, I think one of the most important things is to really understand this matrix here. This tells us everything we need to know about the different types of procedures. So, along this column, we have the type of the S2, the type of reinforcement. Appetitive. In a reward procedure and in omission procedure, the S2 is good. It's food, it's praise, it's whatever, it's something good. It's appetitive. Punishment and avoidance, the S2 is aversive. Shock or being yelled at or something that scares the animal, it's bad. Along the rows here are the contingency between R1 and S2. Again, remember, contingency just simply means, do these things occur together or do they not occur together? It's methodological. It's not that we have connections or associations. It's just methods. So in reward, there is a positive contingency between R1 and S2. Same with punishment. Now we need to be really careful. Sometimes people confuse the idea of positive as automatically good. In this case, positive doesn't mean good. It simply means that these things occur together because we're talking about a positive contingency, not a positive outcome. So in punishment, it has a positive R1, S2 contingency, meaning they occur together. The S2 is aversive, so if the target response happens and the animal or the person or the child or whatever gets something aversive that follows that behavior, I see the behavior, you get the aversive stimulus, those things happen together. So along here, we have the contingency. In omission, we use food or something good, but the target behavior and the outcome don't occur together. If they do the target behavior, they don't get the food. If they don't do the target behavior, they do get the food. That's the negative contingency. And finally, avoidance is a negative contingency between the behavior and the bad thing that happens after, the S2. Do the behavior, hey, you don't get the aversive stimulus. You don't get yelled at. You don't get shocked to your feet. Fail to do the behavior, you do get shocked. These two things don't occur together. That's the negative contingency. Then, in reward and avoidance, the target behavior increases. And in punishment and omission, the target behavior goes down. I will ask questions on exams about contingencies and about whether behaviors go up and down. So this is a good chart to have. So let's review these again using my really bad animation. So let's say we're trying to teach a mouse to press a lever using reward contingencies. If it presses the lever, it gets cheese. If it presses the lever again, it gets cheese. However, if it doesn't press the lever, it doesn't get cheese. Cheese is the S2, it's appetitive, the target response is pressing the little button there, and there's a positive R1 S2 contingency. In punishment, we also have a positive contingency. So let's say we've already trained this animal to press the button, but now we want it to stop. So if it presses the button, we give it something aversive. Press the button, get something aversive. Fail to press the button, you don't get something aversive. So he presses the button and, okay, well that was a bit extreme. But you can see what I'm talking about. And the behavior is going to go down. It's not going to do this anymore. This has a positive R1 S2 contingency. The S2 is aversive, and the target behavior goes down. In omission, the animal can get food anytime. It can get food randomly. It can get food all the time. However, if it presses the button, that's the one time it cannot get food. It can get food all day. However, if it presses the button, it doesn't get food. And the target behavior is going to go down because we've omitted the S2. There's a negative contingency between the R1 and the S2. Do the behavior, no cheese. Don't do the behavior, you could get some cheese. So this is how we train my dog not to beg at the table. So we're sitting there having some food at the table, and we're all enjoying it, and there's some food, some scraps that the dog would like. If the dog begs, this is the target behavior we're interested in. I don't want to yell at my dog. I don't want to punish my dog. I would never hit my dog. But I don't really like this behavior. So if it begs at the table, it never gets food. It loves food. That's the appetitive S2. The target behavior is begging. Now be careful. The target behavior is not begging. It's begging. That's the target behavior, and we want that to go down. So if it does the target behavior, it doesn't get food. If she does the target behavior, she doesn't get food. So the target behavior is the begging, and when I see that behavior, the appetitive S2 isn't getting it. So she might be there at the table trying to get some food, but if she goes over to the other side, somewhere else in the living room, or goes over on the carpet, that's when she can get a little snack. Beg at the table, no food. If we're eating dinner and she's not begging, that's when she can get some snacks. Timeout is a method of disciplining a child where you're not yelling at the child, you're not doing something aversive, you're not embarrassing the child. It's nothing that you're giving, right? Punishment can have its problems. We'll talk about that. All you do is remove something that they like. So let's say the target behavior is a bad behavior that we want to go down, like screaming. We don't want our child to scream unless it's something really important. So if the child screams, that's a target behavior, we remove them from where they're getting some nice stuff. They're playing games or they're around other people or whatever, and we just put them into another environment for a while. We don't yell at them. We don't scream at them. Now, if he doesn't yell, he can play. He can have fun with all of his toys. However, if he yells, then the child is put into timeout and they don't get to play with their toys. The S2 is playing with toys. It's the fun toys. The R1 is yelling and screaming. When the yelling and screaming happens, the toys are not there because the child is removed from the toys. If there's no yelling and screaming, then the child can sit and play with the toys. Again, the target response is yelling. It's not the target response is making the yelling go down. It's just a behavior that we want to modify. Finally, avoidance. And we're going to talk in greater depth about theories of avoidance in another lecture. But it's simply, we might have a little rat in what's called a shuttle box. And we have a little grid at the bottom. And we can plug that in and we can give the animal a little shock. Again, something maybe 1 amp, something that's just uncomfortable but not really hurting the animal. When the light comes on, S1, and the animal fails to jump to the other side, it gets shocked. The target response is jumping to the other side, R1. If you don't do that behavior, you get shocked, S2, aversive. Do the behavior, and there is no S2, there is no shock. So light comes on, jumps, and the shock is over there. They just avoided a shock. The target behavior was jumping. The S2 was shock. When the light comes on, if they jump to the other side, then the S2 doesn't happen. If the light comes on, and okay, that's not a very good jump, but again, it avoided this shock on this side. However, every once in a while, the light's going to come on, and they're not going to do the behavior. They're not going to jump. And what do they get? They get a little shock. So this is a picture of a shuttle box that can be used. I'm not sure. Is that supposed to be a dog? I've always wondered what that is. It kind of looks kind of rat dog-like. But the grid has a shocking grid, and shuttling means going back and forth. Here's another picture with a little mouse that can run back and forth through this little tunnel. Here are the lights that can come on, and it's a way of studying avoidance. We'll get into theories of avoidance in another lecture. Escape, which is also maybe reward, but also maybe avoidance, maybe negative reinforcement. It really is difficult to say. In this case, the shock happens. The animal's experiencing something aversive. And when they jump to the other side, they feel better. So they're avoiding getting more shocks, but they're also rewarded because their feet feel better than they used to. Shock comes on and it escapes from the shock. Shock comes on and it escapes. I probably should have turned the little mouse around, but okay. So you can see how it can be considered avoidance, but also might be considered reward. So again, let's just review. Reward, the target behavior goes up. Punishment, the target behavior goes down. Omission, the target behavior goes down. So remember the begging example? The target behavior isn't begging going down, it's begging, and because of omission procedure, the behavior decreases. And avoidance, the R1 goes up. The target behavior tends to increase. Both reward and omission, we use appetitive S2s. In omission, it isn't the absence of food. It isn't the absence of food. It's food. In reward, it's food or good or praise or something good. In reward, they get it if they do the target behavior, and in omission, they don't. In punishment, we use aversive stimuli. In punishment, if they do the target behavior, they get the aversive stimulus, shock or yell or whatever. In avoidance, if they do the behavior, they don't get the shock. But if they fail to do the behavior, they do get the shock. That's the negative contingencies. The target behavior and the outcome don't occur together in avoidance and omission. All right, let's talk a little bit about what is rewarding. What is considered rewarding? I mean, it's easy, a liver snap, a praise, scratching on the belly, whatever. But there are some theories about what are in fact considered a reward. So the first one, the argument is a bit sort of tautological. Tautological means sort of a circular argument. Somebody says, oh, well, something is rewarding, a stimulus is rewarding if it increases a target response. We know it's rewarding because it increases the target response. And then you say, okay, what increases a target response? Something that's rewarding. See how that's circular? It's rewarding because it increases a target response. And what increases a target response? Something that's rewarding. Doesn't really help us theoretically. Another idea is what's called transsituationality. Transsituationality, which is the idea that something is rewarding, something is considered a reward, and S2 is rewarding if it can reward behavior in multiple situations. This reward makes an animal press a lever, run through a maze, do all these things. Okay, transsituationality, I don't think that helps us a lot theoretically, but we're getting a little closer to definition. I'd like to talk about 3 other theories of reward. The first theory was put forth by a really famous learning theorist, a guy named Clark Hall. We'll talk more about Hall in other lectures. And his idea of what is rewarding is if it reduces a primary drive. This is called a primary drive theory. What's a primary drive? A primary drive is something like hunger. You haven't eaten for several hours, and you have a drive to get food. Thirst is a primary drive. Sometimes we call this a tissue need drive. Anything that reduces a drive is rewarding. Anything that helps the tissues, as he says. Now, let's take an example of teaching an animal to press a lever. Let's say the animal hasn't eaten for 8 hours. Now, if it is very hungry and it presses a lever, gets a little bit of food, that's very rewarding. But that same bit of food might not be rewarding if the animal just ate, just had a bunch of food and it's full and it doesn't have the drive of hunger. So food in that case might not be rewarding because it doesn't reduce a primary drive because the animal doesn't have a primary drive. So, carbohydrates, proteins, fats, water, salt, oxygen, these all can act as rewards if there is a drive to get them. Other ideas, possibly arousal, visual stimulation, auditory stimulation. Sometimes we have just a drive for curiosity. We also have what's called secondary drives. These are just things that are associated with a primary drive. So what rewards you for your job? And you say, oh, money. I get rewarded for money. Will you do that? Yes, I'll do that for money. Will you go and work an extra hour doing this thing, lifting all this stuff? Sure, if you give me a lot of money. Can you eat money? No. Does it reduce the primary drive of hunger? No, but it's associated with things that can. So money, which is just paper with some ink on it, has come to be associated with getting food and getting water and getting drinks and get all those other things that reduce primary drives. We call that a secondary drive. Same idea. The second theory is called the hedonic theory of reward. Sometimes rewards, according to this theory, are just pleasurable. You've heard of the word hedonism, somebody who just seeks pleasure. Hedonism is the idea of pleasure, hedonic pleasure. So something might not reduce a primary drive, but just be pleasurable, and it still can act as a reward. Reducing a drive can be pleasurable. You're really hungry, you eat food, you get pleasure from that. But sometimes just music, sometimes just something entertaining can reward an animal and people. Something can just be kind of fun. And like there's been examples where monkeys learn to press levers so they can play with a little string like on a guitar and make sounds, or they can see something visual, or they can look out a window, or they can get entertained in some way. That's fun. It's something interesting. Finally, we get to the third theory that I'd like you to know, and that's called the consummatory theory of reward. Sometimes the act itself, the behavior itself is rewarding. Something might not reduce a primary drive. Something might not be pleasurable. It's just the act itself, the behavior itself. Poets call this the glory of the imperfection, meaning the idea of striving to do something. The action is so pleasurable. I like having to do something. The road traveled and not the destination. Why do people climb mountains? Because it feels good to do that action. It reduces primary drive. Climbing a mountain won't reduce a primary drive. It'll add to those drives because you get hungry and you get thirsty. But the act itself can be very rewarding. So here's an example. Here's a little mouse, and it learns to press a button, but it doesn't get to consume something. It doesn't get the act of consuming, and it doesn't get pleasure, but it does reduce a drive. This is how we do it. So the animal presses a lever, and it gets an injection of glucose. It gets a little glucose pumped into its veins. Was that tasty? No. Was that fun? No. Was it pleasurable? Ouch, no. Did you get to consume anything? No. Did it reduce a drive of the need of the body for glucose? Yes. And this little mouse will learn to press a lever if it's low on glucose to get glucose shot into its vein. Okay, so here's an experiment that kind of shows the hedonic theory works. So this was done actually in the 1960s, but they used an artificial sugar, a saccharin it was called. And in this artificial sugar, it was sweet, it tasted good, but it did not help the tissues of the body. It doesn't work like glucose. It's artificial. It can't be broken down in cellular respiration and used to make energy. None of that. It just goes through the system. But it tastes good, right? So will this animal learn to press this button to get saccharin, artificial sugar, placed on its tongue, allowed to lick sugar water? This is not sugar water. This is saccharin. This is artificial sugar water. So it's not helping the animal's energy needs. Does the animal learn to press the button? You bet, because it just tastes good. Okay? It's not really consuming anything either. It's just having this saccharin placed onto its tongue that makes it feel good. And finally, this theory of consummatory, there's a lot of ideas of consummatory theory. When I was in Hawaii, they did some research with pigeons, and they had pigeons fly from one end of the room to the other. And the research was trying to understand if they understood magnetic fields. So there were magnetic fields at these two locations, and they were trying to discriminate them. But it didn't really work because these caged birds just like flying. That was reward enough. They didn't need the food. They just like to fly. And so that was a problem. They were trying to reward animals to distinguish different magnetic fields, and the animals were just rewarding no matter what they did because they got to fly. Here's another experiment that was done. This one's kind of disgusting, so I apologize. So you have a dog, and you put this little thing called a fistula up and have so that the esophagus, the food in the esophagus that goes towards the stomach, actually comes out of a tube. Again, kind of disgusting. This animal does not, when it chews food, it doesn't go into the stomach. It has to be given food through other ways of getting its nutrition. So the question is, does it learn behavior? Speak. Ruff, ruff, right? Does it? And you give it food. Eats the food, but it doesn't help the energy of the animal because it just chews on it. Chews, consumes, chews, but it doesn't reduce a primary drive. Why doesn't it reduce a primary drive? Because it doesn't make its way to this digestive system. You might also use like some bland food or something that doesn't have a hedonic nature to it, isn't delicious, like a steak. But the animal just chewing, just liked it, just liked the chewing. Didn't reduce a primary drive. Not necessarily very pleasurable, but the act of chewing was rewarding enough to act as a reward to teach this animal, in this case, to speak. Here's another one that's a little fun, a little bit more fun to describe, although not necessarily fun for the animal. So here's what you got. You got a little male rat, and you have a female rat. And the female rat is an estrus, which means that it is ready to breed, and it's putting off pheromones to say, I'm ready for breeding. And the rat navigates a maze like a Hampton Court maze, right? She is ready for loving, and the male is ready to go. So he goes through the maze, he learns the maze, gets to the female, and just when he gets to the female is removed. The male rat doesn't get to copulate, doesn't get to mate. Is that pleasurable? No, probably a little frustrating. Does it reduce a primary drive? If it's a sex drive, that doesn't reduce the drive. If anything, it increases the drive. But getting there, just getting to the female was rewarding, and this mouse or this rat learned to navigate the maze, got better and better at it, and made fewer errors and ran through it more quickly, did all the things we see in instrumental conditioning, and the reward was just the act of getting to the female because it didn't get to mate, which didn't have pleasure and didn't reduce a drive. Remember, I've talked a little bit about these fish experiments that I've done. And so here is two male Siamese fighting fish, beta fish. And they love to display their gills at each other. And they fight. If they were in the same tank, they would fight each other. But there's a little partition between them, a little plexiglass partition. And I wanted to know, well, can that be a reward? Can fighting be a reward? Because it doesn't reduce a primary drive of getting food and tissue needs like Hull talked about. Might be pleasurable, maybe. And maybe just the act itself of fighting is rewarding. So here's that little tank that I've shown pictures of, and the little fish starts here, and it goes down there, and it goes over, and in another little jar is another fish, another Siamese fighting fish. And I just asked, will it learn to navigate this maze, take a left turn to get to another fish? Now, when it got to this end here, it couldn't see that there were fish. It had to make a decision, come into this spot here, before it got to see the reward. If it took a right, then this was not lifted and there was no fish to fight against. And here's just a simple thing. The choice of the arm that was rewarding, and you can see that they preferred to choose the side that was rewarding. They found that fighting with another fish was rewarding and taught them and acted as a reward of the instrumental response, target response, of turning in the right direction. Then I did another experiment, and I changed the design of this so that one arm was really long and one was really short. And I had the idea that, okay, if this was a mouse and this was food, not fighting a fish, but this was a mouse and there was no water, then taking a right to get to just traveling a little short distance to get to food would be preferred than having to walk a great distance to get food. The least amount of effort. It gets food more quickly. If it takes a right, it gets food almost immediately. And if it takes a left, it has to go down about a yard before it can get food. And if I was doing this with a mouse, it would definitely learn to go right because that's where the food was quickly. Would that be the same thing with fish? If it takes a right, it gets to fight with another fish really quickly. But if it takes a left, it has to swim a whole yard way down here to fight with the fish. And of course it's going to take a right. But that's not what it did. It was really kind of interesting. This is the proportion of choosing the shorter distance. I thought that as they learn, they would want to choose the shorter distance more and more often. Greater proportion, greater probability. But they didn't. They preferred to take the longer route. They preferred to swim longer to get and fight. And when I was running this experiment with students, and we were doing it the first few days, because this is the average response of, I think, something like 16 fish. And the first couple fish kept swimming the longer distance, and I'm seeing that on the record, and I'm telling the research assistants, I'm like, what are you doing wrong? You're doing something wrong. This isn't what the animals are supposed to do. They're like, nope, they like to swim the longer distance. No, I think and I had to watch it happen. So, why did they like traveling a whole yard to get to another fish to fight, as opposed to taking a right and going an inch and fighting with the fish? Why did they choose the longer side? I wasn't sure. I wrote a paper about this and I wasn't sure. One thing is they like the swimming. They like to swim the longer distance. Swimming is fun. Or maybe if they swim the yard, they are protecting a larger area from that rival fish. By going all the way to the end, they're covering a longer distance. And the reason that these animals fight is because of mating and protecting their range of where they live and protecting that area from other invaders. So maybe the longer swim was protecting a longer area, and that was more rewarding. It was kind of interesting.